Hello there, welcome back and welcome to part 52 in my build log series of the Trumpeter 1/200 scale model of the Titanic. Today I am going to be doing a number of things. First and foremost, I'm going to be doing the engine casing deck housing. So that's the bit which goes here and it just butts onto the dome that we did in the last episode. So it's just the next bit of deck housing forward on the boat deck. Now I am going to show that, but I'm going to show it largely in time-lapse and stuff like that, because I feel like the last few episodes I've done, I've been doing deck housing. And although they're all subtly different, the processes I go through to finish them are pretty much the same. So I don't see a huge amount of virtue in showing the same stuff again. So I'm going to do a lot less description in this episode, and I'm just going to do a lot of the stuff on time-lapse. Other stuff that I'm going to do, there's a number of little odd jobs that I've been sort of meaning to get on with for a long time. You know, the stuff that I just need to devote an evening to that to get it finished. The stuff like, you know, painting various gunnels teak coloured on the top to sort of represent the wooden rails that we had. I need to get on and start painting some people, because I have hundreds of 1/200 scale people and they're all just in resin colour at the moment, and they need to get painted. So I'm going to start doing some of that. And I'm also going to start having a think at some of the more functional stuff as well. So at the moment, it is quite a challenge to get the superstructure onto the ship, because there's loads of different things that you've got to align before it'll sort of fit properly. There's all three of these smoke extracts for the funnels, and these have to penetrate through all three decks. So there's a lot of stuff that you've got to sort of twist and tweak to get in. On top of that, there's the electrical cable for the lighting into the superstructure. And then while you're doing all that, you've got to make sure that the superstructure is actually aligning properly with the ship underneath it. Now at the moment, it's just a bit of a faff, but in due course, it's going to become much, much more important that this becomes an easy job, because as my boat deck becomes more and more cluttered with detail, we're going to have lifeboats, davits, people, deck chairs, rigging. It's going to become a very, very delicate part of the model. And I really don't want to be sort of, you know, plonking it down. No, that's not right. Lift it up again, plonk it down. It's going to be a recipe for disaster. Things are going to get broken, and it's just not really going to be helpful. So I'm going to make myself some sort of funnels which are going to sit in the superstructure, and they're going to guide these pipes into the superstructure. And that should hopefully make the job quite a lot easier. Now I've bought myself a new toy which is going to help me out with this. So I'll show that later on in the episode. But for now, let's crack on. As always, to start with, using a relatively keen microfile to remove all the detail that I don't want from the plastic moulding. This will all get replaced later on with photo etch details. Right, so I've got this sprayed up, so I'm now going to go over and get some of the holes drilled that I need to do, and then we will spray the top grey, and then we'll move on to some of the more photo etchy details. So as you can see, I've now drilled the holes for the deck lighting, but what I'm doing now is I am drilling the holes internally, oversized to accept the LEDs. So you can see there, you can see it's just a slightly bigger hole internally, which just provides that nice aperture in which to mount my surface mount LEDs. So I'm not covering this in great depth because I've done it before, but you know, it's not rocket science at all, but it makes my job easier down the line. But it also massively increases the likelihood that the components that I do install will last. Only thing really to be careful of here is to make sure you don't drill too deep, and that you don't break out the other side and end up with a really large hole. But I suspect that's unlikely. So there we are. Quite simple, but a worthwhile job. And it saves a lot of time later. Right, so we'll return to the deck housing a little bit later on in the episode, but for now I want to introduce you to my new 3D printer. I've been meaning to buy a 3D printer for years and years, and I just never got round to it. There's been loads of instances on this model alone where I really could have used one and it would have saved me so much time and I'd have ended up with a better result, but I didn't have one, so checkmate, couldn't do anything about it. So I've finally taken the plunge and I bought myself an Anycubic Vyper. This is a plastic filament printer, so it works by printing a layer of plastic and then another layer on top of that and another layer on top of that, and that's how it builds up the model. This won't generate the really, really fine detailed parts like you can buy from China 3D. But that's not really what I'm after. What I'm after for this is I wanted a means of rapidly prototyping quite complicated mechanical systems. And that's what these sort of printers do brilliantly. You can make a model on a CAD system, print it off here, assemble it and see if it works. And that's what's so brilliant about these machines. You can do things that would take me months and months and months to build by hand. So really powerful. And it's the sort of technology that just, even 5 years ago, just didn't exist. So it's a fantastic bit of kit. And I'm really looking forward to using this more in my models as I go forwards. So for today, I'm going to use this to try to make the funnels that I talked about earlier, the funnels that guide the smoke extracts up into the superstructure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a CAD model on Fusion 360, and then we'll send it across to the 3D printer, print one out, and see if it works. So here we are, and my funnels are now glued in place. Here's the forward one, and this glues onto the boat deck itself, and we can see, if we move the camera, penetrating through onto the boat deck, and you can see the idea. This sits and sinks down into the bowels of the ship, and as you lower the superstructure, it just sort of captures the silicon tubing. The other two funnels, so this is funnel 2 and this is funnel 3, these attach on a deck, and the only reason for the difference is because the first funnel, I've cut away all the plastic here to make space for the electronics. So that's the only reason for the difference. So the next thing is to test to see if it is actually easier now to remove the superstructure and to replace it. So I'll do that in just a sec. But it's interesting, I was just thinking actually, it's interesting that these form a very similar sort of structure to the structures that were actually within Titanic herself, because of course Titanic's boiler rooms went from about here all the way to about here. And so there were large funnel structures that diverted the smoke produced in all of these boilers from this relatively large area into the 3 distinct casings that became the funnels which sat above the superstructure of the ship. And so these resembled massive upside down funnels, and you know, very similar to these funnels that I produced here, really. So it's one of those things that, again, it sort of shows you the amount of stuff the engineers had to fit into the comparatively cramped spaces that were available to them in the ship. So quite an interesting bit of work, really. So with these funnels now in place, I can come along and I can put my superstructure down, and the funnels just sort of guide the pipes up through the superstructure. And that is now far easier than it was before. The hardest bit about this is actually filming it in such a way that you can actually see me do it. But what I've done is I've added a little bit of grease to each of these just to sort of reduce the friction between the 3D printed part and the silicone tubing. But this has really, really simplified the process of getting the superstructure in place, and that is exactly what was needed. In other news, I've also discovered a new contender for White Star Buff, and I'll be interested to know people's thoughts in the comments below on this colour. Right, so I'm just going to start painting some people, and this is a job that I've been meaning to do for a long time and I haven't really got on with it. I've got loads of them to do, and there's more than these, but I've got strip after strip of different people. So just to give you an overview of what I've got, these are all people from the Tori factory, and there's I think there's 3 different sets of these now. There is a crew and officers set, where you get various different, very sort of prim-looking gentlemen in officers' uniforms, and they come out very nicely. Then there's a passengers set, where you get a variety of different passengers, men in suits, men in more sort of third-class get-up, trousers and suspenders, that sort of thing. And you also get selections of women in dresses and stuff, which is brilliant. And then there's a third set, which is passengers and animals, which I haven't got. But these are really good because, I mean, the detail is wonderful, down to the coat buttons on the jackets. You know, the detail is genuinely brilliant. And what's also really good about this is there's lots of different figures. So sometimes when you're building a ship the size of Titanic, where you want hundreds of people on the decks, you can fall foul of the fact that they only print 1 or 2 different poses. So you know, you might have hundreds of people on the decks, but 2 different poses, and it looks like you've got a ship full of clones. With this set, there is genuinely a lot of variety. You know, there is 6 or 7, probably even more, versions of women in dresses, some with hats, some without hats. There are 9 or 10 different types of men in suits. There are similar numbers of third-class looking people. There's a real variety, which is exactly what you want, because it gives you that sort of difference of sort of, you know, eye-catching detail on the deck. My only criticism of these is that there is practically no people sitting down. I think there is only 2 people sitting down in the whole set, and that's a bit of a shame, because I want people sitting on my benches, on the third-class poop decks, on the aft portion of A deck, people sitting on deck chairs on the boat deck. You know, I want people sitting down as well as people standing up. So that's the only deficiency, I would say, of the Tori factory stuff. So I've done a bit of digging and I've come up with these. And I've not done anything to these yet. These are straight out the bag. But these are figures, I think they're actually made for the hatchet part Titanic. So they're not designed for this set, but it's still 1 to 200. And this is a selection of, I think they do 2 different types. They do people standing up, and then they do children and people sitting down. So I've got a big bag full of these people. And there's another big bag over here full of these people. So I'll get on and paint those as well. But that sort of ticks the box for people sitting down. And hopefully, it's hard to tell when it's in black resin. I can't quite tell at the moment, but I'm hoping the detail is comparable to the Tori stuff. Might not be quite as good, but I think it'll be comparable at the very least. So let's get on and paint some of these things. And so off we go. Goes without saying, but of course you do need a sort of steady hand for this kind of thing. This is one of those jobs that you can't really do in an evening. You know, you can't sort of say to yourself, right, I'm going to churn out 100 of these in an evening, because inevitably you get frustrated and you make a mistake and you get more frustrated and so on and so on. It's the sort of thing that really, if you can just do 10 a week, you'd be surprised how many you end up with in a relatively short space of time. So to start with, it looks quite boring, doesn't it, you know? But that's because the way I tend to paint these figures is I tend to paint the largest colour first. So in the case of gentlemen, which is what these are, wearing suits, it doesn't make any sense to paint their skin tones first. It makes a lot more sense just if they're wearing a brown suit, paint them entirely brown, and then pick out the detail later on. Pick out the shoes, the sliver of white shirt you might see where the jacket comes up on the chest, the skin colour, that sort of thing. You know, it makes a lot more sense to paint them all brown first. So the first bit of painting is actually pretty straightforward and not all that exciting. You can see again here, selection of gentlemen, again here in sort of greys and green tweedy kind of colour suits, but nothing particularly mesmeric yet. The detail comes later. So we're at the final sort of stage now, and you can see there's not a huge amount of detail going on here, really. I only tend to use about 4 colours on each figure. So you've got a sort of a suit colour, which could be brown or grey or a greenish tweedy kind of colour, but you know, a suit colour of some description. And then black or brown for the shoes, a sort of flesh colour. In this case I'm using a flat flesh colour, which is by Tamiya, I think. Yeah, Tamiya XF15, and the actual paint is called Flat Flesh. And then there's another detail colour to sort of pick out additional detail. So for most of the gentlemen, that's a white shirt under the jacket. For some of the officers, it's something a bit different, like some buttons on their uniform, for example, just to just give that a little bit more detail. But we're talking about such fine detail here that really any more than that is fairly pointless, really, because you just don't pick this stuff out. Now, once you've seen me paint one of these, you've seen me paint them all, so I'm just going to show one of these for the film. And what I'm doing here is I'm painting the flesh colours, so doing the whole head, and then I'll go back and do hair later. And of course, really, steady hand is useful, and a good paintbrush is particularly useful as well. There we go. Not a lot to it, really. I'll do one more. So I'll do this chap on the end with his hat on. That's his face, and then last of all, the hands. Now, where is his hand? There it is. Lovely. So that's then pretty much done now, and these will just dry. So for first and second class people, I'm tending to go off photos I've found online for fashion of the time. For men, it's pretty straightforward, really. You know, suits and ties, that sort of thing. Obviously, the cuts of suits would have changed, but at this scale, it's very difficult to work out how thick someone's collar is. So for men, it's fairly straightforward, really. Suitish kind of colours, blues, greys, blacks, browns, some greens maybe, but relatively straightforward. For ladies' fashion, a bit trickier. By 1912, things, particularly the car, had really changed women's fashion. Unfortunately, the 3D prints take care of that sort of thing themselves. But colours, I'm sort of going off what I found online. Browns and blues, some yellows in there, and sort of floral patterns as well. But there's a reasonable amount of information you can access for the first and second class passengers. For the third class, I am slightly struggling to know where to pitch it, really, because I think, bear in mind these are third class people. They're not the poorest of the poor, but equally they don't have the extreme wealth of the upper classes. So what I'm trying to do is sort of strike a more sort of functional look to the clothing. So for the women, I'm going for sort of browns and sort of nice colours, but women probably not wearing hats, that sort of thing. So we're losing the more sort of frivolous parts of the fashion, let's say. And for men, I'm going for more sort of like hard-wearing clothing, I suppose you could say, sort of flat caps, shirts, braces, that sort of thing. But I'm slightly struggling to find source material for third-class fashions of the time. So if anyone can point me in the direction of some information, that would be very much appreciated. Right, so here are my first and second class people that I have painted up to now. Not a particularly diverse group of people, but representative of passengers on the ship. And here is the relatively small number of third class people. Need to crack on and get a few more of these done. Okay, and back now to today's feature programme, the engine casing. So, just a quick one, there's a grating that goes here, which is to be populated by this piece. Problem is, if I put this over now, you're going to get loads of light coming out, and I don't like the idea of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the back with some black plastic, and that'll give us the idea that the grating sort of goes down into the bowels of the ship. So that's the idea. In other news, I have put some foil on the roof, which hopefully will stop light bleed issues. Now I'm just having a look at the layout of the inside of this engine casing piece, just to work out if I need to do anything special for the lighting. And you can see that on the port side it's just tank rooms, in the middle it's engine casings, and at the starboard side at the aft it's another tank room. But here we have the engineer's smoking room, and that accounts for these 4 windows here. So my plan is to try to light those 4 windows whilst leaving the rest of the area in effective darkness. So we're going to crack on with that now. Right, I've just finished the ventilation flaps on the top of the engine casing, and these are particularly fiddly, and the reason they're particularly fiddly is because each of them in their own right is a sort of triangle. You know, you've got the vented, slotted bit underneath, and you've got this upstand, and then you've got the actual plate cover on the top. And what's particularly exasperating about it is that each one of them can be compared very happily to the other 7. So you've really got to make 8 identical parts, because if you make one even a millimetre out, it really shows up because they're all so close together. So very tricky and very time consuming, but it does look very nice in the end. Now what I've done is I've boxed off the engineer's smoke room section, which should hopefully mean that we only get light coming out of these 4 windows here. I've also put a sort of cover over what becomes the engine casing. And the idea of that is to stop any light shining out through these gratings in the ceiling. So I've now added all the sort of paraphernalia and stuff that went on the top of this casing section, with the exception, of course, of the railings, which I'm leaving till later on in the build, and also there were a couple of pipes that went up onto the 3rd funnel from here, which I've left off as well. But there's some ventilators of various different descriptions. In fact, all 5 of the white things are ventilators of various different types and things. And there's also this sort of stack of wood at the aft section. And this was general purpose wood. There's a couple of different stacks of this on the boat deck, and it was just there to sort of, in the event of needing to make goods for just, you know, odd repairs and so on, the wood was just left there just in case it was ever needed. Quite tricky to paint wood, I always find, because of course it's a natural product, so there's no one paint colour that will suffice. So what I've done is I've used 3 or 4 different colours of brown, and then I've also added on top of that a sort of brown wash, and that gives the impression that the brown wash sort of picks out the individual planks that make up the stack, and of course the multiple different colours of brown just sort of give that, hopefully, that slightly more sort of authentic, natural kind of colour to it. And then I've picked out the white sort of clamps that hold it down in white paint after that. And there we are. But it looks quite nice, really, and it provides a rather different colour to anything else on this casing. So I do think it looks rather nice. So now the only other thing to do is the lighting. One of the little things I've done to make the install of these sections easier is I tend to install them with a connector. So that means that I can do all of the soldering and stuff and all the gubbins for the actual piece that I'm gluing in place. For example, in this case, the engine casing. And then I can worry about the solder connection into the rest of the lighting circuit later. And that connector just allows me a little bit more flexibility. It stops me having to worry about soldering fine joints whilst also worrying about gluing stuff in place. And so here we are. Here is the finished engine casing. Sorry, I'm eating a mini egg at the minute, hence the voice is a little bit distorted. Finished engine casing, and I'm very happy with it. Ignore the squeeze out from the light stopping paint. That's the same as the stuff on the dome. I haven't got around to removing it, but essentially when this dries it goes rubbery, and then you can just scrape away any excess without any black residue remaining behind, so it's a really good product. Deck lighting, very good, and the only lights with any light shining from them on the entire block are from the engineer's smoking rooms. That is exactly what I was after. Very happy with it. No light coming out of the actual engine casing vents, which is lovely. But the bit, I have to confess, the bit I am most happy with is the strip of wood, which seems like a strange thing, but I find wood particularly difficult to paint. You know, it's a natural product, so there is no right or wrong way of doing it, but I find it very, very difficult to do, but I'm really happy with how it turns out. It looks to me genuinely very realistic. I'm very happy with it. But anyway, another good bit of work done. We are moving forward. Next we'll move on to the third funnel base, and then it'll be the officers' quarters, and then we really are getting into the latter stages of the model. And so there we are. Here ends the video. I hope this was useful. I hope you enjoyed it. This was a good bit of work to be done. We're starting to make the boat deck particularly delicate now, though, with the addition of those, particularly the flaps on the top of the engine casing. The boat deck is starting to become quite a delicate part of the model, so we're certainly moving in the right direction, but we are getting to a point where I have to be quite careful with how I handle things, you know. So yeah, end of the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, comments, whatever, pop them down below, and I'll do my absolute best to get back to you. If you have enjoyed this, like and subscribe, usual YouTube gumph. You can follow me on Instagram if you want to get more routine updates of what I'm doing as well. Model Boat Guy, and you'll find the page. And I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.